Good evening, Sukihotu. Welcome to another session of Awakening series. Today is number 7. Today we will be sharing part 2 of the Paṭiccasamuppāda teachings based on the lessons by Bhante Punnaji. Without further ado, I'll just share with you this link. You may download the presentation slides from this link so you can follow along. Today, as part 2, this is actually, we're going into details of the Paṭiccasamuppāda. Last week, we had part 1, which was just a summary of the Paṭiccasamuppāda, and that gave a quick overview of what the whole Paṭiccasamuppāda is about. So starting from today and the next 3 weeks altogether, we will be going deep into the details of Paṭiccasamuppāda step by step so that we can have a more complete, more comprehensive understanding, right? So I hope you are now ready. If you can have the notes, then you can join us and go along with it. Now, I would like to begin by sharing a question that came from one of our followers, one of our readers, Brother Tay, and he asked that question. Before I do that, I just like to mention that I will be using material from this book. As you can see there, I will share with you the link to download this book if you don't already have it. And Brother Tay was referring to page 60. And there's a question. Dharma is called akalika because it is independent of time and space. Dharma is an explanation of how time and space come into being. Now, this is what Bhante wrote in that section on that page, and Brother wanted to have an elaboration. So I will be elaborating. In fact, the complete answer to this question is a little bit deep. So let's get on with it. All right. Now, akalika comes from this salutation to the Dharma, right? Swakato Bhagavata Dhammo Sanditiko Akaliko Ehipasiko, and so on. And the translation, there are two very popular translations. I can't say which one seems to be more popular than the other, but the first one translates the word akaliko or akalika to timeless, right? And we'll examine in more details the deeper meaning of timeless. Now, timeless, if we look at it from the English language perspective, the word timeless will have basically three meaning in the context of the Dharma. First, it is basically referring to the fact that this teaching was relevant and applicable during the time of the Buddha, and that's 2,600 years ago. And as of today, this teaching is still relevant and applicable. So it was good then, and it is still good today, with no loss of benefits. And it will still be good 2,600 years from now. So this is the first meaning of timeless, that a teaching can withstand the ages. Doesn't matter whether it was in those days of the Buddha or now or in the future, this teaching is still very relevant and applicable. So that's one meaning of the word timeless. A second meaning of the word timeless is that you can gain the benefit without delay, because it does not depend on time. It can be immediate or expeditious. You can get the benefits very soon. You don't have to wait long time. So that's why it says timeless. It does not depend on time. And there's also a third meaning of the word timeless, and that is unchanging, unwavering. That means it was based on a teaching that was delivered 2,600 years ago. And as of now, and even in the future, nobody has the authority to change it. It is something that was taught then, and it should remain as is today without changing. So it is unchanging, unwavering, not to be modified over time. So in other words, we cannot say, oh, this is modern time, we got to adjust it. No, that's why it's called timeless. You don't need to make changes to it, right? So these are three common meaning of the word timeless. Now let's look at the other translation. The other translation calls it immediate. So in other words, that is really only taking number two. If you look at the three explanations at the top, it's number two, basically, benefit without delay, immediate, right? So it's basically referring to immediate benefits. So let's take a look at the actual word, akalika. So the actual word is akalika. And it came from the Pali root word kala. Kala means time. Kalika means it is slow, it is gradual. That means the time is moving very slowly, or it is very gradual. It is not something very rapid, and it is delayed. Right? So this is kalika. But we know that in Pali, if you put an A in front of it, akalika, then it makes the meaning the opposite. So therefore, it is something that is not bound by time, something that comes quickly, does not depend on time. It is non-temporal. That means it's not dependent on time, and it can happen very quickly. So here, that's why it's so translated to mean immediate. You can get immediate benefits from practicing the Dharma. So these are the basic meanings of this term akalika. Now, nobody can say exactly which of the three is specifically what the Buddha meant, but I think we can safely say even all three are applicable. All three have the same effect on this meaning of the word akalika. Okay, so having now understood the meaning behind this word akalika, we can now move on to take a look at what Bhante wrote. All right. So here in this second translation, it means immediate result, expedient fruition. That means when you practice it, you can expect that you can get benefits from it. There is no delay in the benefit, right? You get it pretty soon. Maybe not instantaneous, but you will get it pretty soon. So not much delay there, okay? When you practice Dharma, you don't have to wait for the rest of your life before you can see the results. That's really what that means. So it doesn't matter which of the three meaning of timeless you are using. They all three are applicable here. So now let's take a look at Bhante Punnaji's writing here. And this is the page that brother was referring to. Akalika, it is not temporal. That means does not depend on time. Independent of time and space. And basically, Dharma is an explanation of how time and space come into being. That means how we begin to create the concept of time and space. Right? Time and space is really something that our mind has to deal with. Right? So because our mind creates the concept of a world, so we have to begin to examine this concept, how beings exist and interact, so there is a space involved, and how beings age, so there's time involved. But what is important here, what Bhante was pointing out is, and this is really the answer that brother was asking, time and space are dependent on the Dharma. I repeat, time and space are dependent on the Dharma, not vice versa. That means the Dharma does not depend on time and space. It doesn't matter where it is spoken, it is relevant. Right? So Dharma is relevant regardless of where it is spoken, regardless of when it was spoken. But whether our concept of time and space arises, that depends on the way the Dharma has presented this teaching. So today, specifically to the teaching of Dharma, we are referring to Paṭiccasamuppāda. And there, when I go into details, you will then see the more detailed explanation that explains how time and space is a concept in the mind, right? As we look into the detail of the Paṭiccasamuppāda. So Dharma, the word Dharma is often mistranslated as truth or misunderstood as truth. Well, that it is not truth. Dharma does not mean truth. Of course, we often use the teaching to say, oh, this teaching is the truth. But the word Dharma itself, as a Pali word, it doesn't mean truth. It means experience. It means something that you have encountered. It's an experience. So that's really what Dharma specifically means. So relative to that, right, then what is the Buddha teaching? Well, the Buddha was a bodhisattva for many lives and then become enlightened. During the time he was a bodhisattva, he had experienced a lot of pleasures. Lust and greed arised, anger and hatred arised, and the delusion of self-centered existence. So as a bodhisattva, he had experienced all that. So when he became enlightened, he realized what is good. So he realized this is something he should share with the world. So he was teaching his experience. That's exactly what it is. The Buddha was teaching from his experience. That's why it's called the Dharma. So the word Dharma itself in Pali means experience. What Bhante Punnaji mentioned even better, he says, even better, think of it as process of experiencing. That means this process of experiencing, okay? Basically, experience is the perceptual and conceptual process of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and thinking and feeling. Basically, the six sensual realms, our five physical senses, and the sixth sensual realm of the mind. So time and space are dependent on the Dharma, not vice versa. And we're going to later on look at what is meant by perceptual and what is meant by conceptual. So it's basically the process of experiencing. That's what Dharma is. And in the process of experiencing, that experience gives rise to the notion or the concept that there is time and space. Right? Now, the answer to that question is quite extensive. So I will actually go on and answer it further on and connect it with time and space. Right? So experience precedes existence. I repeat, experience precedes existence. That means there is experience arising. And with the arising of that experience, then existence became a concept, right? That arose after that. So therefore, space and time, which are the product of existence, are now the product of the arising of existence, which came from experience. So therefore, that last part there, therefore, space and time are products of experience. What Bhante Punnaji really meant is that because of experience, we begin to have the notion, the concept of existence, and in having this concept or notion of existence, then we have time and space, right? So therefore, it's important to recognize time and space refers to existence, and experience comes before existence, and because of experience, the experience in this samsaric world, we begin to carry the notion of existence. So we're going to take a look at existence versus experience, and that is a very important part of today's sharing. And I must point out, remind each other again that when Bhante said concurrence of logical antecedents, we have to understand the three types of antecedents. The first type is basically talking about time, temporal. So for example, when you clap your hand, you are clapping one after another, right? Even if you clap continuously, you cannot have two claps happening at the same time, right? In that sense, so you basically one after another in time, that's temporal. The other one, you put objects one next to each other, positioning the objects, then one object in front, one object at the back, then they are positioned next to each other in space. So that's spatial. The third type of antecedents is logical, which means whatever happens depends on the presence of the necessary conditions. So the first two, we're basically talking about time and space. That is the existential concept of antecedence. But the third one, the logical antecedent, is an experiential concept, because logical antecedent is referring to the moment-to-moment dependent on conditions. That means when conditions arise, one moment to the next, all the necessary conditions are present, then something happens. That's why it's called logical. And that is what we call experiential. So we're going to explore existential versus experiential, especially in the way we think. So Bhante Punnaji is sharing with us a couple of segments where he clearly explained why is it that our mind tends to be existential. All right. So before we go there, let's come back to what does Paṭiccasamuppāda really means. And here Bhante used the Sanskrit version, Paṭiccasamuppāda. Okay, prati means coming before, preceding, right? Happening first. Itya, being, that means arising, right? Happening. Some actually means together. It also means simultaneous. It also means, that means it's going together at the same time, right? So it's happening at the same time. It's concurrent. It's in harmony, right? So they're not in conflict, in harmony. So simultaneous, at the same time, right? And finally, utpada means coming into being, arising. So in other words, when conditions, prati itya, when conditions are present, then the outcome happens, utpada, at the same time, simultaneous. So that's why Bhante calls it concurrence of logical antecedents. So Paṭiccasamuppāda, as Bhante has translated it as concurrence of logical antecedents. The popular translation is 12 links of dependent origination. Well, they are links, but if you think of them as links, it's a very existential thinking. One link to another link to another link. But here it's talking about things happening, the conditions coming together and then arising. So it's more an experiential mindset we have to carry. So now let's take a look at the popular three-life model, the most popular explanation from the past, right? This is the past. Many teachers nowadays are not supporting this anymore, but it is still being supported by a few people. The popular three-life model. It is based on karma from the past life, and as a result of past life karma, we are now reborn into the present life. And then from this present life, whatever we do, our karma in this present life will determine how and where and when we get reborn in the next life. So it's really the three-life model, past life, present life, and the future life. But this is very existential thinking centered around karma and rebirth.
The common translation is speaking about how a person creates three lives. That means how a person performs some deeds which are called karma. The word karma refers to what you do. What you do in thought, words, and action. Three ways of doing things. One is thinking in a certain way, the other is speaking in a certain way, and the other is acting in a certain way. So three ways of expressing your behavior. And according to the way you behave or act, you are supposed to be reborn in the next life. And once you are reborn in that next life, then how you live in that next life will determine how you will be reborn again in the third life. So in other words, according to that way of thinking, what is called the Paṭiccasamuppāda is an explanation of how rebirth takes place.
So that was Bhante Punnaji's explanation that this is based on karma and rebirth. And here, Bhante Punnaji went on to explain the way we are thinking in terms of karma and rebirth is really an existential paradigm. We need to make this paradigm shift. That's why Bhante keeps saying we need to make a paradigm shift. Our mind is locked into existence. And many Buddhists basically centered their life and centered their behavior based on the practice of karma and rebirth. Well, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that that is a very existential paradigm. So let's now listen to Bhante explain this existential paradigm because of this karma and rebirth thinking.
There is a sutra also in the Majjhima Nikaya, which is called Sabbāsava Sutra. The word asava is there. Asava is that flowing in or influence. In that Sabbāsava Sutra, the Buddha points out that the normal person thinks, did I exist in the past? How did I exist in the past? In what way did I exist in the past? Will I be existing in the future? In what form will I exist in the future? Do I exist now? In what form do I exist now? In other words, the normal person is thinking in terms of the past, present and future. And that way of thinking confirms the idea, I exist. And if you hold on to that idea, I exist, you will never be able to gain freedom from suffering. In other words, to be thinking of karma and rebirth is to be unable to gain freedom from suffering. And then the Buddha points out the Arya Savaka, the disciple of the Buddha, doesn't think in that way. He's only thinking what is suffering, what is the cause of suffering, what is the ending of suffering, and what is the way to end suffering. If he begins to think in that way, that person's suffering will come to an end. Why is this? This is something very important to understand. What this means is that karma and rebirth is a fact that the Buddha has seen through his own experience. Yet, if you keep on thinking in terms of karma and rebirth, you cannot gain freedom from suffering. If you want to get freedom from suffering, you have to start thinking in a different way. And that is to avoid thinking in the existential way. Now, that is the important thing to understand.
So Bhante was pointing out that we need to avoid thinking in the existential way. We are continuously thinking in existential way in two areas. First is if we are locked on to, our life is locked on to just karma and rebirth and thinking that is what Paṭiccasamuppāda is all about, then that is a very existential thinking. It's not to say that we should not think about karma and rebirth, and that is not what Bhante meant. What Bhante meant is that if we center our life around karma and rebirth and think that Paṭiccasamuppāda is talking about karma and rebirth, then this is a very existential perspective of what the Buddha was teaching us. There is another way that we often think in existential way. And that is when we think in terms of subject-object from that experience. Now, what this really means is that when, let's say, in the process of seeing, when we see a dog, so in this experience of seeing, there is only the seeing, there is only the experience. So there is just experience of seeing. But when we see something, we begin to think of it as an object out there. And because we think of it as an object out there, we then begin to think that there is this subject in here that is seeing that object out there. If you think there is an object out there, then there must be a subject in here. And this breaks up that experience into objective, subjective. And that's really what Bhante is going to explain to us.
To exist is to think in terms of an existence of a subject and an object. We are all the time thinking in terms of a subject and an object. When we go to learn the English language, we learn the subject, the object, and the verb. The subject, the object, and the verb. That is the normal way of thinking. That normal way of thinking, if continued, you cannot bring suffering to an end. That's what it means. So we have to get out of that way of thinking. So to get out of that way of thinking, is to think in what is called the experiential way of thinking.
So Bhante was saying to get out of this existential way of thinking is to think in the experiential way. But how do we think in terms of experiential? Right? So this is very important, as I mentioned earlier, moment to moment dependent on conditions. So whenever anything that happens, we have to think of it as things are happening because of the presence of the necessary conditions. So moment to moment, when anything arises, we then examine that it is arising because of the conditions. So if we were to think in that terms, then we are thinking in experiential way. But if we think in existential way, we will begin to think of, oh, it must be my past life and all these, I must have done something and all that. You know, it's not to say that you should not look back and feel that you have done something wrong and you need to correct yourself. It's just that don't look at everything that happens as the result of karma. We know it is, but look at everything that happens as the result or the outcome of the presence of necessary conditions. And that's how we think in experiential way. So now let's very quickly go through this again, the experience of seeing. And that depends on conditions. You need light. Without light, you can't see. And light is reflected from the dog entering the eyes of the person. And because of this process of perception, then that person has a mental image of having seen that dog. So that mental image arises from this process of perception, the Panchakanda. So this mental image is rupa. So there's a mental image arising. Now, that is just an experience. That's all it is. So Bhante was saying, think of it as experience. And experience is the moment-to-moment presence of necessary conditions. So in other words, right, this mental image arising is because of the dog, light reflected from the dog entering the eyes, and we're able to see the dog. So this is really the moment-to-moment presence of necessary conditions. There is this experience. But the mind, unfortunately, is very good at breaking down this experience of seeing. And this process of breaking down this experience of seeing is called dichotomy. Dichotomy of experience. Dichotomy is an English word that means breaking into two distinct parts, right? So this is really what the mind is very good at doing. So the mind begins to project, oh, there is a dog out there. So it has already broken that experience into something out there, the objective experience. So this something out there is the objective experience. But if there is something out there, then the mind will begin to figure out and come up with the notion, there must be something in here. So that is the subjective experience. So I must be seeing the dog out there, right? So now let's take a look at this explanation of experiential way of thinking.
The experiential way is to see that what we see or hear or smell or taste or touch, it's an experience. Seeing is an experience. Hearing is an experience. Normally we think I come first, and you or the object comes, and I see you or the object. So that means the subject and the object comes first, then the subject and object meets, and the subject sees the object. That is how people think. But that is not what it is. The seeing comes first, and it is in the seeing that the subject is created and the object is created. It is in the process of seeing that I come into being. And the object comes into being. When that is properly understood, then the idea of existence disappears. It is only when that idea of existence disappears, you are free not only of existence, you are also free of what is called death. If you don't exist, how can you die? That is awakening from the dream of existence. This is why the Buddha is called Buddha. Buddha means one who has awakened from the dream of existence. One who has awakened from the dream of existence. That is that third knowledge that the Buddha spoke of.
Okay, very quickly on that last statement, Bhante said that that is the third knowledge. Actually, Bhante was delivering the sutra called Te Vijja Sutra, where the Buddha was explaining that he had acquired three knowledges. The first two, the first one is for him having the ability, the Buddha was able to look at his own past life, going back many lives, way back, very many lives, countless lives. So the Buddha was able to look at his own past lives, going back countless lives. And the Buddha was also able to look at other people, how, because of their own karma, they end up in their present situation. And the Buddha was also able to see other people's past lives. And these two are basically relating to the Buddha's ability to see karma and rebirth. But the Buddha was not depending on that. The Buddha was using that as a way to help people. But here, Bhante mentioned the third knowledge. The third knowledge was the Buddha's ability to see everything in the experiential way, in terms of Paṭiccasamuppāda, that the necessary conditions come together, arising moment to moment, giving rise to something that is happening. So the experiential way is basically looking at an experience and seeing the conditions that give rise to it. And that's what Paṭiccasamuppāda is really all about. It's about the arising of an occurrence when the necessary conditions come together. Now, I just want to go back to this slide here. It's very important. Bhante was saying that we have all we have is this experience of seeing. When we see an object, light reflected from the object, this experience of seeing, the mind breaks it into two parts and begins to project the idea there is a dog out there. And therefore, we have created the notion there is space. Space out there and in here. That is spatial. It's out there, I'm in here, you know. So that is creating the notion of a space, that objective experience and the subjective experience. So the dichotomy of experience basically creates the notion of space. And because of this notion of space, and if our mind is locked on to this notion that things exist physically, right, then we are basically locked on to existence. I will explain a bit more about why thinking of existence leads to rebirth. Now, a lot of people think the opposite. A lot of people think, oh, I exist because I was born. But in Paṭiccasamuppāda, it's the other way around. Because my mind is locked on to existence, I will be reborn. So in other words, my being born is the result of the mind being locked on to existence. And I will explain that next week, because this week we are not reaching that part of Paṭiccasamuppāda yet. We are looking at the first half of Paṭiccasamuppāda. So remembering that when we look at something and we begin to think of object and subject, that is existential thinking. Right? So that's because the mind likes to break that experience, dichotomy of experience. Experience is dichotomous. An untrained mind naturally breaks an experience into two parts. Right? So basically, the subjective part, that means in here, the subjective part, we tend to personalize as mine, me, mine, I am here, I am inside, you know, me, self. So this personalization creates the notion of a self, and a personality exists. I am here, right? I'm in here. And at the same time, the objective experience is out there. So it creates the notion that's out there, and this really creates separation between us and what we are experiencing. Because all there is just experience, but we begin to break it into out there objectively and in here subjectively. Right? So therefore, we have alienated the world, broken the world in as out there. You know, I'm not experiencing out there. I'm creating the notion there is something out there, and there's something in here. We break it. That's what Bhante meant by experience is dichotomous. The dichotomy becomes the foundation for an emotional relationship between the subjective self and the objective world. So when this experience is dichotomized into out there and in here, then we begin to say, oh, if it is something out there that I like, okay, I will go near it. If it is something out there that I don't like, I stay away from it. So that is this emotional experience that is being created because of this dichotomy of experience. Now, if you want to know more about this, then I would suggest that you read the book I have given you. I will give you the link at the end of today's sharing, that you read this book that Bhante has written. This is the Arya Magga Bhavana level 3 book, right? So basically, we think of matter as something objective, right? It exists, it occupies space, and the mind, so the matter and the mind is something that is subjective. It is in here, right? So, and because of this dichotomy of experience, dichotomy of seeing, we begin to, this dichotomy of experience arises because of the thought that comes to the mind, right? When you see a dog, the first thing that arises in your mind, that very first thought, I see a dog out there, you see? And so when the mind says, I see a dog out there, what is happening is The dog is out there. That is the objective experience. I see. That is the subjective experience. See, that thought, we have broken, dichotomized that seeing into the dog out there and I see. Right? So this is really how the mind easily breaks an experience into objective and subjective. Think about it. If you walk around the mall and suddenly you see coming towards you is your good friend, your next door neighbor, your very good friend. What is the first thought that arises in your mind? I see my neighbor. I see my good friend. Right? So that I arises. And the experience of seeing is broken into I and my friend, separated. So now let's go into the Paṭiccasamuppāda proper. Paṭiccasamuppāda, Bhante translates as concurrence of logical antecedents. This is basically dealing with the arising of necessary conditions, and these necessary conditions that arise, they give rise to an outcome. So the next thing will happen, so to speak. So now, I have discussed in great detail this point that Prince Siddhartha, Bodhisattva Siddhartha, had been seeking enlightenment, went to 2 teachers, and then finally found a way to meditate up to the point where he was able to stop the mind. That process is called Sanya Vedayita Nirodha, cessation of sensation and feeling. The mind stops. And waking up from that, he then became fully enlightened as the Buddha. That waking from that stopped, the mind that has stopped, he was already enlightened. And at that first thing that happens, he witnessed how the Paṭiccasamuppāda was unfolding right in front of him, that the mind was creating all these things, stage by stage. So it begins with avijja, which is insentience, and no sensation, no feeling. This is the state of Sanya Vedayita. This is the mind being stopped because of Sanya Vedayita Nirodha, where the Bodhisattva Siddhartha meditated until the mind stopped and something triggered the mind to be awoken. And here we can say it's the Panchakanda, basically, that something must have stimulated the senses and kick-started the brain, and then the mind awoke from no sensation, no feeling. It began, it kick-started. Now, of course, we are not able to go into detail how this kickstart happens, but basically, that mind being kick-started, the mind began to create, construct. So Sanya Vedayita, together with Sankara, makes up that process of construction. This is the Chitta Sankara, constructing Sanya and Vedana together, producing Vijnana. Right? So from a state of insentience, the construction started, and this is mental construction of sensory entities visualized, sensory entities experienced. So this is the sensory. Here it is about sense organs getting started. Right? So there, this Sankara began to construct. Right? So now let's listen to Bhante's explanation of this starting point.
Now from that state, again he woke up from that state. And when he woke up from that state, he began to understand how the mind begins to work. So from a state of no mind, he started the first activity of the mind was what is called feeling and sensation. Feeling and sensation. Sensation means, to understand what sensation is, it is important to understand that we said we have eyes, and when light falls on the eye, we begin to see. What do we see? What we see is only light. The light comes in different frequencies, and therefore you begin to see different colors. And this seeing color is what we see. And at the same time, we begin to see this color either as pleasant or it can be unpleasant. Some colors look beautiful, some colors look ugly. So that is what we call feeling. So the sensation is the color, and the feeling is whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. So that is the first thing that we see.
So the Sanya and Vedana comes together, and then construction is started. The Sankara is started, right? So with the process of construction, the mental construction of sensory entities are Sanya and Vedana, right? Then it produces Vijnana, which is the perception of the constructed object. Vijnana is basically the perception of having experienced seeing that object, or experiencing one of the senses, experiencing the object, then Vijnana arises. And the mind begins to interpret this Vijnana. So when light enters the eyes, and then this mental image arises, we begin to give it a name. So Vijnana leads to Nama Rupa. There is a mental image arising. So Vijnana Pachaya Nama Rupa. So the perception of the constructed object and categorized identity of object. So when the mind sees a mental image of something arising, we begin to identify what it is and call it a name. The mental image is Rupa. The name we call it, or the label we assign to it, or what we identify it as, that is the Nama. So let's listen to Bhante's explanation on that.
So the sensation is the color, and the feeling is whether it is pleasant or unpleasant. So that is the first thing that we see. But when we open our eyes, what we see doesn't look like seeing colors. We are able to see objects. How do we see objects? It is simply an object is constructed by putting the colors together. When a person draws a picture on the wall or in a paper, that person is only putting colors on the picture. And it is when we look at those colors that we see it in the form of a face, or in the form of a tree, or maybe in the form of a table or bottle or whatever. We are seeing objects by putting the colors together. It is a construct. So every object that we see is a construct, a mental construct. So we put the colors together and form a construct. And we not only form a construct, we identify it. We are able to look at a thing and say, oh, this is a face. How do I know that it is a face? Because I have seen faces before. So that object that we see is put into a category of objects that I have seen. That is called categorization. It is by categorization that we are able to identify an object. I can look at an object and say, that is a chair, or that is a clock, or that is a door. All that is because I am categorizing what I look at. So this identification means we are also giving a name to that. So every object has been given a name to identify that. When we say clock, that is a name given to that object. When we say table, we are giving a name to that object. So there is an image and a name. Now this is what we call Nama and Rupa. Rupa means the image and Nama means the name. So these are the words that we use. Vedana, Sanya, Sankhara, Vijnana. That Vijnana word is perception. But perception means identifying the object. That is the meaning of perception. We are not only seeing things, we are also able to identify and say, this is such and such. That is the meaning of perception.
So we are able to identify. So this Nama Rupa is constructed entity, is the mental image arising, and categorized identity is the name we call it. So now we are aware of something and we've given it a name. All this is part of this cognitive process called the Mano. This is the thinking mind, the learning mind that is producing this result. And let's take a look at how this is all happening, the identification. So when activities in the environment stimulate our sense organs, then these Paṭiccasamuppāda, the 5 aggregates, arises and we begin to have a perception. So this is the process of perception. Because of the Paṭiccasamuppāda, the 5 aggregates, we now have a perception of something we have just seen. So for example, seeing the dog, there is a mental image arising. And therefore, this perception, first, there are two parts of the perception. The first part is that there is the image, and then the mano, the cognitive process, comes in and begins to try to interpret it by referring to memory of past experiences, categorized memory of past experiences, and able to identify it. And this is called papancha. And this identification is a recognition. See, the ability to perceive an object with the eyes, that is cognition. Now you are referring it to memory and then giving it a name, that is recognition. So you are basically redoing or re-evaluating what you have cognized. That's why it's called recognition. Interestingly, the word recognition, if you were to pronounce it properly according to the English language, it is recognition. That's what it is. You recognize an object. And this process is called papancha. A more specific term of this is papancha sanya sanka. That means with what was perceived with the sensation, right, you then begin to categorize the identity. Sanka means categorization. And this is why it's called recognition, recognition. And then you begin to create the concept. The mind starts to create this concept of an entity identified as a dog out there. So the dog is the name, and the out there is the objective experience. So this is really how the mind is really working. And this is what the Buddha was seeing it arising stage by stage in the Paṭiccasamuppāda. So now let's take a look at Bhante's explanation of papancha sanya sanka.
Papancha is really identification. Identification.
Is it the same as categorization then?
That is right. It is by categorizing that you identify.
Yeah.
That is the meaning of papancha sanya sanka. Sanka is category.
How do you spell it? How do you spell sanka? Sankara.
Well, spelling, it depends on the language. if you use English letters, then Sanka is S-A-N-K-A.
Okay, so it's not Sankara then. It's Sanka.
It's the root word of Sankara. Is that
No.
Sankara is different.
Sankara has nothing to do with
Sankara is construction.
Yeah. You see, Sankara comes from the Sanskrit Sanskara.
Right.
And Sanka comes from the Sanskrit Sankhya.
That's number, right, Bhante? Sankhya is number.
Sankhya is not number, no.
Or
No. Sankhya is a category.
okay. Yeah.
Sankha. Papancha sanya sanka. It is by putting it into a category that you begin to identify.
So Bhante was saying that this papancha process has this process of papancha sanya sanka, meaning it's able to identify the sensation of what has been perceived based on category. So categorize identification of an object. Take, for example, what is this? Many of you would have said, oh, it's a computer mouse, right? But most of you would never have seen this mouse before, because very few occasions I've ever shown people my computer mouse. But how do you know it's a mouse? Because you have seen hundreds of mouse before. And in your mind, you now have a category called mouse, and hundreds of all the mouse you have ever seen in the past, you put it into that category. So when you see this object and it looks like objects in that category called computer mouse, then you naturally identify it as a computer mouse, right? So that is really how that works. Now let's take a look at what the scientists have to say, and this is very interesting. This is basically explained by Western neuroscience documentary that I happen to have in my collection. So let's take a look at what these scientists were saying about this categorized identification process.
Take a look at this object. One glance and you know what it is. But how do you know what it is and where it's positioned in space? Well, let's break it down. The light reflected by this object is converted by your eyes into an electrical signal and is sent down a neurological pathway called the optic nerve to the back of your brain. Starting in this region, called the visual cortex, the image is cross-referenced with memory of past experiences stored throughout your brain as you try to identify the object. Once it's figured out what it is, your brain has to decide how the object is positioned in space.
So that is how we identify objects, because of this category that is in our memory all the time. And the visual cortex will process that. Now, we not only see objects, but we can hear, smell, taste, and touch. Simple example, I spoke about this before, but I'll just repeat it for the benefit of those who haven't heard this. Take, for example, you're taking a walk in the park, and then you see this dog coming towards you. Right, this dog approaching you, very cute little dog. And from a distance, you see the dog coming towards you, wagging its tail, and the dog starts to bark in very cute sound, woof, woof, and then you hear the dog. And as the dog comes near you, you begin to touch the dog. But at the same time, the dog has been out there in the park the whole day, so the dog has a lot of perspiration, so it's a bit smelly. Now you begin to smell the odor, smell the perspiration of the dog. You pick up the dog, and the dog begins to lick your face, and somehow, you know, your lips get licked by the dog, and you happen to taste the saliva of the dog, very yucky. So you have that full experience of that dog, seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, right, together, and then you begin to think about what you have experienced. This is experiencing through the six sensual fields. That gives you a more complete and comprehensive experience of the objective experience. Let's listen to Bhante's explanation. He used the word object. The object simply means the objective experience. He's not talking about that one object, but that whole objective experience.
What we have perceived is simply an object which comes in the form of an image and a name for it. An image and a name for it. Then, once that image has been made and the name, we say Vijnana Paccaya Nama Rupam. Nama means the name, Rupa means that mental image. Then we talk about Nama Rupa Paccaya Salaayatana. Now, Salaayatana means we are not only looking with our eyes, we are also hearing with our ears and smelling with our nose. We are also tasting with our tongue, and we are also touching with our body. This is why you give something to a small child. That child will want to put it in the mouth and touch in various ways, get all the impressions. So that is why all those things are put to form an object. So it is not only the eye that we are using. When I look at this bottle here, I see it as a bottle, but I know that if I touch the bottle, this is how I'll feel it. Even if I have never touched it, I still know when I touch it, I'll feel it like this. That is because I am using my memory. I have touched bottles before. So you see, because we have using all the five senses, we put together all that to form an object.
So in the video that Bhante ended by saying to form the object, when he used the word object, he actually meant the objective experience. The whole object is the world out there, because we put these experiences of the five physical senses and our thinking and feeling put into it, and then we have a full experience of the objective world. So from the seeing to the other physical senses, and combined with the cognitive process, the mano, we begin to interpret. So we have a more complete experience of the object. So with nama rupa comes the experiencing of the six sensual realms. Right? So we experience these six sensual fields of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, cognizing, which is thinking and feeling. Then we have a complete experience. And basically, the word vijnana has often been translated as consciousness. But Bhante Punnaji has pointed out the word vijnana, when it relates to the five physical senses, it is sense perception, not consciousness. Basically, we're talking about the eye perception, the ear perception, nose perception, tongue perception, body perception. It's only when we come to the mind, the mano, and that is mano vijnana. That is the consciousness, where we are able to cognize the sense perceptions, cognizing the five physical sense experience and putting it all together, comparing it with our memory, and then able to identify it by category, papancha sanya sankha, and then able to recognize and give it a name, nama and rupa, and then we are able to have a more complete experience, cognizing the experience, and we begin to create concepts with that experience, and that makes the whole experience referred to as consciousness. That is number 6. The mano vijnana is consciousness. The other vijnana, the chakku vijnana, sota vijnana, ganya vijnana, jivha vijnana, and kaya vijnana, these are perceptions. So Bhante make that clarification, and it's basically, that is really the way Bhante has explained it very precisely, that sense perception is perception, not consciousness. Consciousness is when there is an awareness of the objective experience and the subjective experience. That is consciousness. So creating the concept of this objective experience, the world out there, and then putting the sensory experience of the 5 physical senses and the one mental perception, put it together, and that is the 6 sensual realms, 6 sensual fields. Then the whole thing we begin to cognize, and this process of cognition is called phassa. Phassa has been translated as contact, but a more accurate meaning is really the cognition of the world out there, the cognition of a complete objective experience. So that is really what is meant by mano vijnana, the cognition of the complete experience. That is consciousness, bringing into awareness there's a world out there. So what is perceived through the senses, the 5 physical senses, are perception. What is perceived by the mind, that is cognition or consciousness. So now let's listen to Bhante's explanation of Phassa, concept of the objective world. And when Bhante says forming an object, what he really meant was that it is this dichotomy of the objective experience. So the word Phassa, Bhante explained, is it means becoming conscious of the objective experience, the objective world.
So you see, because we have using all the five senses, we put together all that to form an object. That forming an object is what is called Phassa. Salaayatana Pachya Phasso. Phassa means the formation of an object. Today the word Phassa is translated as contact. Phassa is not contact. Phassa is the formation of an object. The object is formed by making use of all the five senses, not just one sense. So that complete object is formed. That is Phassa.
Now, Bhante used the word object to mean the objective world. That's really what he meant. So it is by putting all the five senses plus the mind, the cognize, so see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and cognize, putting it all together, six sensual realms, then we begin to form this, this objective world. And that is the process of Phassa, which is the part of this cognitive process. And Bhante just calls it simply cognition. What it means is becoming conscious of the objective experience of a world out there. So with Phassa, the concept of the existence of a world is now created in the mind. There is a world out there, right? So this is really the process of Phassa. And I think we have enough for today. And this basically completes the creation of the concept of the object we call the world, right? So this really is the completion of the cognitive process. Now, up to this point, the mind is completely aware, having this cognitive process, aware of a world out there. Okay, so with that, I end my presentation for today. So remember to download the presentation slides. I don't see any questions. So if you have any questions, please let me know later. Right? So you download the slides, download the diagram, the Paṭiccasamuppāda diagram. All right, so tiny.cc, Paṭiccasamuppāda, and also the book, level 3 book. And please feel free to email me or contact me by Facebook if you have any questions about today's sharing. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much for joining us. We have spent this past hour and a half together sharing the Dharma and accumulated much merits. We are also aware that there are many people out there suffering from the pandemic. So let's put our palms together and share our merits with all those who are suffering from the pandemic by reciting this together. We dedicate the merits we have acquired from sharing the Buddha Dharma to all beings affected by the coronavirus pandemic around the world. May suffering beings be suffering free. May the fear-struck fearless be. May grieving beings shed all grief. May all beings find peace and relief. By the grace of the merits we have acquired, May we never follow the foolish. May we follow only the wise until we attain the highest and most supreme bliss of Nibbana. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Idang me nyatinang hotu sukita hontu nyatayo. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Thank you very much for joining us. Please don't forget to download the presentation slides and the Paṭiccasamuppāda chart. And let me know if you have questions. I wish you all, please stay safe. We are going through difficult times. Please stay safe. Please stay healthy. May you and your family be well, comfortable, peaceful, and happy. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.